Thanking Della, who is our director of the events team for Biopsy USA, for the opportunity. And I'm going to be introducing our guest speakers today. I had the pleasure of meeting Andreas Benzing earlier this year through a friend of mine, a business associate and friend, Michael Murphy, who is a Business Council of Westchester member and a local builder construction company, and very much into the green building space. And he wanted to introduce me to Andreas, and immediately I had a million ideas of ways to connect him with our Hudson Gateway Association of Realtors, and also to FIOPSI. And so invited him to be part of the FIOPSI USA webinar events. And Andreas is a lead AP, CPHD, and is the founder of the New York City-based architectural firm AM Benzing Architects and the New York Passive House executive director. He is also a part-time assistant professor at Columbia University and Parsons School of Design, and currently living in the New York area. And we're joined today by his colleague, John Oppermann, a licensed real estate broker and consultant with Avenue 8 that I've just heard a lot about, a unique broker focusing on green and healthy residential real estate options. And he is also the executive director of Earth Day Initiative. The topic for today is "It's more than being green, selling your client on high performance homes in this current market." So today's discussion, we're going to explore how to approach your client with the most powerful arguments about passive house strategies and sustainable practices. How does a healthy and comfortable home influence your well-being and at the same time reduce your energy bill? So I'm going to turn it over to Andreas and John, and thank you once again for being here today. We will have a Q&A session at the end of their presentation, so please put any questions you have in the chat, and we will get to your questions at the end. Welcome, John and Andreas.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I think I was going to kick it off with just a quick intro of kind of how I got into this, and then Andreas can do the same. So I'm John Oppermann. Thank you for having us. Really excited to talk to you all today. A bit of background, I usually just go over kind of the different domains, the different hats that I wear in this space and how I got into this work. So I run a nonprofit called Earth Day Initiative. We have been around for many decades, organizing large-scale Earth Day events in New York City, but also coordinating various Earth Day organizers across the country and around the world. And over the years, we've grown into really robust year-round programs with a sustainable food education program, a renewable energy campaign, and one of those programs is also a green building publication. And through my work on this green building publication that discusses various trends and developments in the green building field, and working with developers and architects and designers to write articles to talk about those trends and developments, I started to realize that there is really an understood or sort of undervalued market around sustainable homes, and that our publication was really a lot like the rest of the green building industry, and that our publication was very much talking to industry. It was a lot of industry talking to industry. So it's articles written by developers, architects, and designers for an audience of developers, architects, and designers. And there was not a lot of effort to break through to the mainstream of just the average person, to talk to people about, here's why it would be beneficial for you to live in a more sustainable and healthier home. As someone that really cares about the environment, I find that that's unfortunate, and that there's this missed opportunity that we've left out there on the table of really growing the demand for sustainable homes that are better for the environment, better for the people who live in those homes. And what could we do to really remedy that? that is what led me into working with some colleagues in real estate and joined a real estate brokerage practice where we started to develop a real focus around sustainable homes, consulting with various developers and sellers in the sustainable home market, and then acting as brokers in the New York City area for buyers and sellers in that particular market, connecting people who might be interested in a more sustainable and healthier home in New York City to those properties in New York, and then working with sellers to really advertise them in a way that will resonate with people, and breaking through some of the sort of mistakes that I have seen folks in the sustainable building industry make as far as not really developing messages that resonate with people. So I have my hat as executive director of Earth Day Initiative, where we do really large scale programming with high profile folks to get people excited about getting involved in environmental campaigns and volunteering and greening their lifestyle. Then I have the real estate brokerage, where we focus in particular specializing in sustainable and healthier real estate. And then I've also taught a course at NYU focused on this topic of marketing green homes, where we explore the various channels through which we could perhaps better market green homes to the broader public. And that's sort of the framework that we'll use today through this presentation, going over how you could be talking about sustainable homes in a more effective way that might resonate with the general public, potential buyers, sellers, and how we can actually stimulate that market and the demand, which then hopefully would then lead to a greater overall supply for more sustainable homes. And I think, Andreas, you could go to the next slide. Yeah, so this is just a little bit of background that led me to get into this, of the fact that there is a really large supply of more sustainable homes, whether they're built to the LEED standard, passive house, well standard, or if there's not a particular standard, but they've just been built in a more sustainable way, a high performance building that uses less energy, is generally reducing its overall impact on the environment, creating a more healthy, hospitable environment for its inhabitants. There's a lot out there. People just don't really know about it. And in my experience, people maybe have heard of LEED. The average person has not heard of passive house, but their main touch point is maybe they see the LEED plaque as they walk into a building that says that a building has been LEED certified, but then their overall understanding of what that means and what goes into a green building is pretty limited. So the average person, even folks actually that I know that are very well versed in sustainability overall, for instance, I have a friend of mine that ran a very successful sustainable fashion company. When I was talking to her about green buildings, she said something like, I honestly don't know what that is. Does it mean that there's solar panels on the roof or maybe a green roof? And yes, that might be one of the factors that goes into it, but that's one of 100 or 1,000 different factors that could go into a more sustainable building. And it's just unfortunate that we in the sustainable building industry haven't done a better job of communicating the benefits of a sustainable home and also just what it is to the broader public, because it's a conversation that could be stimulating that market overall, but it hasn't really been had. Then we've had more recent developments with Local Law 97, for instance, in New York City, and the All Electric Building Act that will really stimulate the market and make this part of the conversation in New York. It's really going to be forced into the conversation in New York. And we've seen this already with the energy ratings on the front of buildings in New York City, where it says a letter grade, and it kind of like the restaurant letter grade starts to bring it top of mind for people, where they start to think, so this has a good grade, the building next door has a bad grade. How is that going to affect me as a potential buyer in these buildings when you're comparing these various properties that you're looking at? And I think, Andreas, you wanted to say a little bit about this as well.
Yeah, so I'm of course I'm an architect. I'm coming from the more architecture side. I actually met John during a presentation we gave with New York Passive House, where we also did a course, an educational course for realtors on how to market high performance buildings better and have a better understanding of sell it, so to speak. But I think what is important for us to understand is that the framework has changed quite dramatically in the last few years, specifically probably in the last 2 years. New York City, of course, we have the 80 by 50 plan, but most jurisdictions in the US plan according to that Paris Accord, so meaning reduction by buildings of 80% carbon emissions by 2050. So it's a very short time frame in which we have to achieve. Therefore, the legislation is quite aggressive currently. New York City, New York State, and also California are leading that effort. In New York City, we have local law 97, as John mentioned. That's a carbon emission law, which limits carbon emissions by building or by buildings, and it's phased in 2024, and then phased in over the next 10 years. And if that applies to all buildings above 25,000 square feet, and if you are above that carbon limit, you will have to pay quite a stiff fine. So it's very important for selling buildings that there is a liability attached to an inefficient building. In addition, that's true for New York State and also for California. We have what is called an All-Electric Building Act, which will kick in at the end of 2023, so already next year, which will require all residential buildings in New York State to be all-electric, meaning you won't be able, for residential buildings above 3 stories, which means you won't be able to install any fossil fuel infrastructure anymore at that point. And so I think that's a very aggressive framework. And I think we should be aware of what is coming, and it certainly changes the industry quite dramatically.
Yeah, and I think these developments with the legislation and regulation is really going to, as I said, force the conversation. I think a lot of times people have been a little bit reluctant, and that includes brokers and folks and real estate professionals, that they've been reluctant to talk about this stuff because it can be daunting. The legislation is very complicated. What goes into making a building more sustainable is very complicated and often confusing if you don't have a background in it. And it can feel overwhelming. This sort of move with legislation and regulation is in addition to the overall increased interest just from the general public in it. I think it's going to start to force this conversation. So now moving into the next section of the ways that we at my brokerage and through, for instance, my course at NYU, we've explored the different avenues of how we could better be talking about sustainable buildings, is looking to other sectors that have broken through to the mainstream before the sustainable building industry. So one is sustainable food. So starting maybe 10, probably more like 15 years ago, sustainable food really started to enter the mainstream, and people's understanding of sustainable food, even if you're not a diehard environmentalist, you at least started to get some understanding about organic or local food or farm to table, eating seasonally, plant-based diets. And it really broke through in a way that we hadn't seen sustainability breakthrough in other ways. I think that there are certain lessons that we can then draw from that. And one is that the marketing and the messages that you're putting out there, it's really personal. And I don't think it's a coincidence that sustainable food was the first industry to break through in sustainability before others, because there's nothing more personal than food. So food goes in your body, and you spend a lot of time eating and consuming food and drinks. And then the sort of concentric circles that we see radiating out from the person, which I'll talk about in a little bit, also indicates why perhaps some other industries have been the ones that came after that. But the most personal one is sustainable food. So the messaging that we look at is really trying to connect with you, where it's like, why is this better for you? Why is this better for you and your family? Parents, for instance, spend a lot of time thinking about creating the most healthy environment for their children and their family. And the demographic that we often think of for talking about sustainable buildings is, for instance, young parents who live in New York City, who obsess about organic food and natural fiber clothing and non-toxic toys. but they don't actually know about the ways that their building, their home, is actually maybe going to affect the health of them and their children. But the food thing really broke through early on. Also, there was a switch as far as sustainability and the light that people shine on it, where decades ago, sustainable often was associated with more expensive, but also in some ways inferior, where, okay, I'm going to buy this sustainable product because it's better for the environment and I'll feel good about it, but it's actually worse than the traditional product. And you think about things like sustainable glues or sustainable dyes, or like whatever the sustainable thing was, there was an association with like, okay, it's better for the environment, but this glue that I use that's more sustainable, it doesn't work. I glue something to the wall and it falls off the wall. That has really changed, and sustainable food has been a big part of that, where sustainable actually communicates a premium product that you want to seek out, not just for its effect on the environment, but it's actually a premium product. You think about like organic food or farm to table. Farm to table restaurants are like the hottest restaurants in town, not just because it's better for the environment, but there's an association due to the work of a lot of various folks like Michael Pollan, Michelle Obama really popularizing this kind of stuff. Farm to table is actually premium. You're going to seek out the farm to table restaurant because it's the hottest restaurant in town. It's premium food, it's better quality food. And you see that really break through in a way, and it switched people's mindsets where it's not a sacrifice, but it's actually a premium thing that you want to seek out. I think that's a lesson that we can really draw into buildings, where it's not just, oh, you're going to live in this building where, you know, it has water efficient shower heads that give you no water pressure. And there's the classic examples of people rebelling against that when cities started mandating more water efficient shower heads. And then there was a black market for water inefficient shower heads because people wanted their water pressure. That's not really the association people have with sustainability now. It's much more like a premium product. And that's reflected in what in the industry you call high performance buildings. It's actually a building that performs at a higher standard than a traditionally built building in terms of its operations, its health and wellness for you and your family, just its overall functioning. And then we can hop to the next slide. So then speaking about the sort of concentric circles of it's really personal for people, communicate in ways where it's like, how is this better for you and your family? Food is the most personal in that it goes in your body. I think it's not a coincidence that the next industry that's sort of breaking through at the moment is sustainable fashion, and that fashion goes on your body. My hope is that then the built environment can be that third wave that breaks through, and that your body goes in buildings. So it's food goes in your body, fashion goes on your body, and then built environment, your body goes into buildings. And we can communicate in ways that say, you know, you're spending up to 90% of your time indoors. What effect does that time spent in what are perhaps not healthy built environments having on you and your family? If you live in a more sustainable building, you can reduce a lot of the exposures that you might have to toxic materials, and you can maximize your exposure to healthier air, healthier materials. But it's really connecting to the personal, where it's like, how is this affecting you? And sustainable fashion, I think, can provide us some examples there in that personal side of things. Also, just in the idea, which I sort of was alluding to in food, that it's just the cool thing. So a lot of the sustainable fashion brands that have broken through, they're not called like better for the planet fashion.com. It's actually starting with a cooler brand where it's like Stella McCartney or some brand that is just cool in its own right. It's being worn by celebrities and famous people. And then it is also sustainable. So start with making it attractive to people. Don't beat people over the head with the, it's better for the environment, but start with the, this is actually a premium product that you want. And here's all of the ways that make it a premium product, which we'll get into next. Andreas, you could go to the next slide. So there's three different pillars that we explore and sort of lump all of the different messaging into when you're communicating about sustainable buildings to the broader public. One is that explicit focus on environmental sustainability. This pillar also can include, though, resiliency, which is much more personal. People start to think about, okay, well, how are increased extreme weather events, potential flooding, increased power outages, how is that going to affect me? And resiliency is really top of mind, I have found, for a lot of buyers going forward, where they're looking at how their home is going to impact their day-to-day business as usual way of life if we are faced with less stable energy supplies or more power outages or extreme weather events. And we have sort of witnessed this with COVID in terms of how a global pandemic can disrupt our way of life. People are thinking more about, well, how do you continue business as usual with disruptions, not necessarily just from a pandemic, but let's say more extreme weather events from climate change. So that would include things like, where are you getting your energy supply? How much energy are you using overall? A high performance building can reduce overall energy needs for heating and cooling, in some cases by up to 90%, which is a crazy amount. And that means that you're just going to be less dependent on getting energy into your home to keep it at a comfortable level year round, if you're sort of getting off of that dependence on energy. Also, where is your home located? That's another factor that I would lump under the sustainability of a building. I have clients in New York, for instance, that were interested in purchasing a townhouse, but there were certain neighborhoods that we just completely roped off from our search, because they're in areas that, with more extreme weather events, potential superstorms like Superstorm Sandy, rising sea levels, they're going to flood more often, and they're really going to have challenges continuing to operate business as usual in low-lying areas of New York City. And that is factoring into the decisions of various people that I work with when they're looking at the location of their home, which is speaking to that resiliency of, like, how is your home going to stand up to future challenges? That's in addition to all of the sort of more abstract ideas about environmental sustainability, which a lot of people do care a lot about, but it's really those like personal factors of how is this going to affect me that I find is the most motivating for people. Yeah, and Andreas, next slide.
Yeah, and I think I want to define a little bit sustainability for buildings, and also, as John said, we are spending about 9% of our time indoors. So getting a building which is healthier and more thermally comfortable for everyone is key, I think, in what we do with high performance. But I think with buildings, when you think about like a high performance building, like a passive house, as John said, we can reduce our energy use by a factor 10 often. We have seen that heating loads are very low and very sustainable, therefore, with high performance components. And so I think that really reduced energy use, of course, has a sustainable factor in terms of lower carbon emission, but also, of course, has a lower cost associated with it, and makes your building much more resilient in case there is no electricity, for example. We can produce that energy more readily in such a high performance building. I don't want to go too deep into the technical aspects, but if you think about high performance or passive house design, which in principle relies more on your building enclosure than on mechanical systems, in general, is a concept which was born almost 50 or 30 years ago. There are many passive house buildings in Europe. We have quite a lot here in New York State. We have many passive house buildings, also retrofits here in the city. But the passive house concept relies, or the high performance relies really on higher performance windows. Usually it's a true pane window here in New York, in our climate. Also very important is we ventilate buildings, so we bring in fresh air from the outside continuously. and we'll do so with heat recovery, so we don't have any loss of energy associated with it, but you have fresh air in your building continuously, and it's also filtered, so it's great indoor air quality. We control airflow in your building more correctly with a great detailing, so you don't have a cold draft in the time, and makes it a very, very comfortable environment. Another aspect, I think, besides like the performance of the building is very important is durability of the building. So really building with more natural materials, I think is important, right? So we don't want to have too much off-gassing in your building. I think that's becoming a more important aspect for clients. We see that definitely. Also a more durable and lower maintenance building is important, I think, and that has a very great impact on the sustainability of your building over time. And of course, increasing the resiliency, as John said, is very important. So we are relying less on input of energy, and therefore we are relying, for example, more on the input of the solar energy. And you can keep your building even without input of energy quite at a high temperature in the wintertime, for example. And so that makes it a very more resilient building compared to a leaky, drafty building, which cools down during the wintertime quite drastically if you're in a situation where you don't have energy available. And just to keep in mind, right, 40% of the overall carbon emissions worldwide, and it's roughly the same number here in the US, come from buildings. So reducing that overall carbon footprint of a building is key. So going forward, that will be part of the industry to reduce that carbon emissions. And then on top of reducing the energy, which has many benefits, we'll go into them more in detail in a second, is of course we can also start to use technology to produce some of the energy for our buildings. Like we could use PV panels, photovoltaic, or geothermal technology. And that really allows us to actually, at the same time, reducing the energy and producing some of that energy on site, become a net zero building. So that building in Mamaroneck we have done is a close to net zero building, which means you can heat and cool and operate the entire building with that PV panel on your roof. And you're independent, so to speak, of any input from the outside in terms of energy. And switching our buildings to all electric is very important moving forward. I think that's a very important part to keep in mind. So infrastructure, gas infrastructure, and oil infrastructure will disappear quite quickly, meaning a high performance building is required in order to run a building on all electric. Otherwise, it becomes very expensive. So for example, switching your gas stove to an induction cooking is very important, and induction cooking often performs often better than a gas cooking. Many chefs use induction cooking, for example, but there are certain things we have to consider when we switch our buildings to all electric. John?
Yeah, and that brings us to the next pillar, the first pillar of environmental sustainability we just talked about, the second pillar of talking about wellness. So really focusing on health and wellness, which is obviously, it's always been very top of mind for people, but really there's a trend of wellness that has broken through in the last 5 to 10 years, probably, where people are really thinking about the health and wellness of their family, what kind of materials are people exposed to, and focusing on, in the case of real estate, what kind of materials are you exposed to in your home? What's the air quality like? A lot of high performance buildings, the environmental sustainability and energy efficiency aspects go hand in hand with improving the overall quality of air in the building. It can also include various aspects of reducing the toxins that you might be exposed to. The average person doesn't know that a lot of wood products actually contain formaldehyde. And if people who are thinking about organic food and natural fiber clothing and non-toxic toys for their kids knew that their kid was crawling around on floors that contain formaldehyde or eating off of countertops containing formaldehyde, they might be concerned about that. But we can do a better job of communicating this to the general public to make that part of the conversation around, here's all of the ways that a more sustainable and healthier building could be better for you and your family. So some of the aspects of what goes into making that air quality better, I think Andreas is going to speak to, but there are countless ways that a more sustainable building is also a healthier building for you. But usually what I have witnessed is when this sustainable building is built, like I mentioned off the top, it says green building, but then it doesn't really go into much more detail about like what makes it green and what makes it good for you. But there is this huge opportunity for us to be really focusing on the health and wellness of a building. And especially in the wake of COVID, with air quality very top of mind for people, air quality became a part of conversation for the average person around the world in a way that it really hadn't been since the last pandemic, probably. And people are thinking about that. And that is a conversation that you can have because it is already top of mind for people. And just the systems that are naturally built into, for instance, a passive house bring in a constant flow of fresh air, which creates a healthier air quality environment in a lot of high performance buildings. And I think Andreas is going to speak a bit more to the specifics of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think with our office, when we talk to clients, it's really important that we don't, especially when we talk about high performance passive house, we usually don't start a conversation with energy savings or reduced carbon footprint, although that's of course is very true. We usually focus on the wellness and well-being of people inside, or for our clients inside our buildings. And so thermal comfort, I think, is key. Is a key component of how to build a better building, and certainly passive house or high performance is very much geared towards the thermal comfort, but probably less talked about. So for example, if you build a building with a high quality building enclosure, that means your surface temperatures, for example, are more equal, more even. Your room temperatures are more comfortable. So you can create a great indoor comfort all year round. And you're very much independent of the conditions on the outside. So if it's a winter storm, your building, your passive building won't recognize that inside. It will feel quite comfortable without a huge amount of energy or heating we usually put into our buildings, which in the wintertime in New York dries out your air, right? There's a lot of discomfort associated with dry, hot air in our buildings. And so one other aspect of that higher quality building shell, but also the higher quality windows is reduced noise. That's really amazing, and it's something which should be more front and center. So if you are in a passive house, and we experienced that in the building in Mamaroneck, and the neighbor is coming with his leaf blower, you close your windows, you hear zero. There's an airplane going over your building, nothing, right? So we can create a building which is so quiet and beautiful inside that you probably won't believe it until you step into such a building and really experience this for yourself. And then, as John said, the air quality is very key for us. So we really make sure that we have a very controlled airflow in the building. So we don't want to have accidental air coming through your walls, for example. That's how we usually often ventilate our buildings. So it's very purposeful mechanical ventilation with heat recovery. And because we can also add filter to that ventilation system, meaning we can filter out any dust. And so you create a great indoor air quality for people. But it's also becoming a very dust-free environment inside. So you won't need to clean as often as you would have to in a regular building, so to speak. And then, yeah, so I talked about the fresh air already, and few pollutants inside the building. And we, in our office, we always make sure that we have healthier materials. for our clients. So how you insulate your building has an impact on your health and prudence inside your building. You know, spray foam is probably more off-gassing, and cellulose insulation, for example, it's a more natural material. So I think keeping your focus on the health and well-being of the clients is key to us, specifically if you do like a high performance building. And it's certainly something which the real estate industry, I think, and also we as architects have to put our focus back on.
And then the third and final pillar that we focus on in terms of messaging is just the economics of a more sustainable building. So part of that is the potential increased value that you would have with a more sustainable building. That is sort of been debatable in the past, where it hasn't been clear as far as the data about, does a more sustainable home, for instance, fetch a higher price on the market? I think that there are reasons why that data has been somewhat flawed, and it really goes back to what I've been talking about throughout, in that we haven't done a great job in the sustainable building industry or the overall real estate industry of communicating the benefits of a more sustainable home to the general public. So we haven't truly captured the overall value that you could be capturing from a more sustainable home, because if you're not telling the buyer, here are all of the various ways, like Andreas just went through, of why this home is actually a more premium product, and it's basically heavily reduces noise from the outside. You can't even hear like construction or jackhammers or leaf blowers happening right outside your home because of the insulation that goes into creating a more high performance building. The air quality is better. You have less exposure to pollutants and toxins. You have all of these things, but if we're not talking to the potential buyers about that, they don't know that, so they're not going to pay more. As you start to communicate these things more effectively, you do start to see those values tick up as far as listing homes and really adequately communicating the value that they should be fetching on the market. The second sort of subcategory in economics, aside from overall value, is operating costs. So if you're reducing your energy usage by up to 90% for heating or cooling your building, you're obviously lowering your overall operating costs. And that's a savings that will extend far into the future through the operation of the home. And that's something that we could do a lot better job of communicating to people as they're looking at more sustainably built homes.
And I think it's important to keep in mind that all the technology we need to build a high performance home, we have. It's not so that we have to invent anything. We know all the technology. We have all the technology available to us at a very reasonable price to build those buildings. And also in terms of economics, we often shift some of the costs from mechanical systems into the building quality itself. And so that's actually a quite cost-effective way to build a high quality product, so to speak, for building. And I think that it's important that we recognize that we are investing into the longest lasting part of the building, which is your building itself, right? Your walls, your roof, and your floors, instead of investing in a lot what we currently do into mechanical systems, which probably have to be replaced in 15 to 20 years. So I think that investment is it's creating a higher quality product, which lasts longer, which serves a much better purpose in terms of health and well-being. But it's also an investment which lasts longer, right, over 100 years or 150 years. So I think that's important to keep in mind. And I think another aspect I think we should certainly put our focus in over the next few years is the inefficiency of existing buildings is quite important now. It becomes almost a liability moving forward. So if you have a fossil fuel driven building, especially if it's a larger building, that's going to be in the next few years, it's actually going to be a liability because you have to retrofit it to high performance or to all electric. And specifically a building which is run on gas or oil, that technology will disappear. It's going to happen quite quick. And so any building which currently runs on gas or oil is technically liable in terms of value, but also I think in terms of operating the building. So I think that's very important key point in terms of economics moving forward. The other chart here just shows like different real estate sectors in terms of size. It's the blue bar, and the average thermal use for those sectors. And you can see that, of course, specific sectors have a higher energy use, like food service, food or healthcare services. They have a higher intensity for energy, and so there's often a higher ability to reduce the overall operational energy. And next slide is John.
Yeah, and then this lays out, I'm not sure if you can read the fine details, so I'll just go through some of these. This lays out how we do try to be really clear with our messaging about what does a green building provide, and then why does this connect to you? So just getting really specific with the messaging, where I do find it's very tempting, for instance, with someone who cares about sustainability, I can start talking about the thing that I think is really interesting, where it's like, this building helps the environment and reduce our impact on climate change by this and that. But really focusing on like, what's the end user? Who is the end user and what do they care about? So for instance, getting into some of this stuff about how the exposure to natural light, for instance. So one of the things that's built into the LEED standard is you get points for views of nature or exposure to natural light. So this would lay out architectural designs, ensure that 90% of indoor spaces have daylight views. And then why is that good for you? Exposure to natural daylight is shown to lead to 45 minutes more of sleep per night. And then going through energy and air quality and comfort controls and exposure to nature, and really connecting with like, here's the thing that exists in a sustainable building, and here's why it's good for you. We always try to pair those two things up, where it's explaining what a green building is, and then saying, okay, and this is why you should care about this. Not just saying what it is, but really making it explicit of why you should care about it. Then I can give you one more example. Is it possible for me to share my screen too?
Yep.
Okay, let me try really quick.
I think you can only share one at a time. So if you unshare one, then you can share the other. Yeah.
Yeah, here we go. And you can see this?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is an example. So I worked with this particular project, which is a passive house building in New York. It's a very ambitiously sustainable building on the Upper West Side. And I developed all of the marketing materials around the sustainable and wellness features of the building. And we did it in a way that the aim was really to explain this to people that maybe have no background in it. So make it interesting, making it engaging. Working with some of the folks that were on the team, some of them are very excited about the technical aspects of it. And we really had to divert it away from like, okay, we got to get away from like trying to explain the really detailed engineering technical aspects, but get back to that thing of like, what is the building and why is this good for you? So really connecting with why should the buyer care about this? So then we go into like the fact that it's an airtight envelope and that it maintains constant thermal temperatures throughout the year. So you can see with the cute little animation, during the summer, it's bouncing the heat waves off. During the winter, it's absorbing those rays to keep heat in, and it's maintaining the same temperature year round. If you want to find out more about the technical aspects of what makes this possible, you click on Learn More for the folks that are sort of like early adopters or maybe just like curious about this stuff. It explains the louver system, that during the summer when the sun is high, the rays of the sun bounce off those louvers, but in winter it allows more sunshine to pass through, which naturally heats the indoor space. Talking about ventilation and what's special about this building as far as ventilation and each unit actually has its own ventilation system that brings in fresh air that's all its own year round. Going into more detail on this, air filtration, which was a big part of this, that really became more top of mind during COVID as well. Sound insulation, the fact that you can have all this like noisy New York City environment around you with your neighbors or New York City streetscape, and you can still maintain a nearly silent environment inside. Less toxic materials inside, and FSC certified wood. So really explaining this with these cute little animations to try to break through to the mainstream. And I think this is a good example of the kind of communications that we try to put out there. And then Andreas, I think we were at the end of the presentation. Yeah?
Yeah, I just want to make one point because I think it's important to make. So I think what we try to communicate here is also that, you know, it's we have to as from our side as architects specifically, but also of course for you realtors to communicate, do a better job in communicating not just the benefits of a high performance building and what is coming, but also really talking to the emotional side of buildings. I think that's very important. And I like to use the Tesla example because it's so drastic, you know, like the electric engine was around for 100 years, but Tesla really made it fashionable, made it hot, made it move everyone right from the internal combustion engine to an electric engine. And that's because they saw it and they marketed it correctly, right? If you step into a Tesla and you hit the pedal to the metal, it goes like a rocket ship, and not like takes a long time. So I think that emotional side, the performance of that car is just overwhelming. It's so different that you have to have one. And I think to communicate that with buildings and real estate, I think is an important part of connecting it to the emotional side of buildings. Like safety, for example, is an important part, right? The well-being in a building, I think that is something we have to do a better job in order to make it more adopted on a larger scale.
Thank you, Andreas and John. If anyone has any questions, you can place them in the chat and we can call on you and can unmute. Thank you for putting the link to the Charlotte project in the chat, if anybody is interested in that. I had a quick question, and that was regarding a lot of people in this group work with global buyers, and I think that sustainable homes is kind of more known overseas than maybe here in the United States. That could be a generalization of mine, but so they're using the technologies more in, say, Europe or other countries. How do you attract the global buyers to these properties or homes?
Yeah, I mean, Andreas, you could speak a bit about that. I think just the history of Passive House is kind of interesting, and that it originally came out of Germany, but now has become, I think, sort of on the upswing in the US. It's sort of the standard that a lot of folks are talking about more than other sustainable building standards. I do think that there's a lot of reasons why different countries have sort of come to sustainable buildings at different times, maybe some earlier than others. Sometimes energy supplies were just naturally more expensive in other countries. We have benefited in the US from relatively low energy costs. As things swing up in energy prices, you do start to see people naturally more interested in more sustainable built environments. But a lot of folks, for instance, from Europe or some other parts of the world, they are naturally somewhat more well-versed in this stuff. And there is a lot of conversation in the industry happening internationally as well.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, the history of Passive is interesting because it actually came from research done in the US, mainly in the 70s, passive solar buildings at the time, and super insulated building. and it was then refined kind of in Europe into a passive house standard, which is very building science based, and it requires energy modeling. So it's a very precise approach to performance of a building. And the good thing is, once you build a passive house, it's going to perform the same everywhere, so to speak, in any climate. So if you do buy a passive house in Shanghai or in Berlin or in New York, it's going to perform the exact same way, and it's also going to feel more or less from comfort and indoor air quality the same, so to speak. So it's a very science-based standard, but I think it does speak to the emotional side of our well-being, and I actually do believe that the US is better positioned to grow that market and make it a real business, because it is supported by a large industry. It's small currently, but technically supported by a large industry like window manufacturers, mechanical systems, insulation systems. So those are all part of the overall industry, which is growing quicker than other industries, I think. And we do see a new window manufacturer here in New York State, for example. They are producing much higher quality, triple pane, very airtight building components, windows, which is great to see. So I think there is a big push for the industry to make it a business, I think.
Is that the View Inc.?